Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm not that often in London, but I used to live here. I went to Oxford University. And I went to a British boarding school in the north of Scotland, and throughout my teen and 20 years before moving to the United States and going to Harvard. And so at Harvard, I came into contact with Tim Leary, and I was a graduate student. He was a professor, and so was Dick Alpert. Then Dick Alpert, who later became Ramdas. So I participated in what they called the research project on psilocybin, with psychedelics, starting with psilocybin, the active ingredients of the mushrooms. And I was...
Be a little bit louder.
Did that for... okay, louder.
You guys can also squeeze in. There's
yeah, come closer.
Yeah, come closer. I mean, it's all, we're all one, it's a very comfy, intimate space, and we've got also stools if you want to sit up. Yeah, come on closer, by all means.
So after the psilocybin project which did a number of research projects, rehabilitation of prisoners, collecting data from normal people in order to see, and it's important to remember that in those days the drugs we're talking about now, which are now completely illegal and attached with many penalties and have a terrible reputation, in the public mind. None of that was true. You could have said LSD, XYZ. It had no charge whatsoever. People didn't know what it was. Same with psilocybin. We didn't know what it was. We had no clue. It was a completely new field. There was nothing in our psychological background, either Leary's or mine or any of us. We were social scientists. In the behaviorist model, Harvard was a behaviorist social science model. And there was nothing. And it aroused a lot of fear. And the one interesting thing to keep in mind about these drugs, they are sometimes called psychoactive drugs, they affect the mind. The primary effect of the drugs is to affect the mind, the way you perceive things, the way you perceive reality, the way you perceive yourself. There's no thing you can say, well, what does this drug do? It's impossible to say that, because and Leary invented this, initiated this theory called the set and setting hypothesis. It all depends what the amplifiers of perception, so the experience you have, it depends on the set or the intention and the setting and the context. So the same drug was used in alcoholism therapy treatment, in prisoner rehabilitation. It's a therapeutic drug. It's still being researched again now, for different kinds of therapy. But other people used it for other people. The CIA and the military used it for brainwashing, for example, which we didn't even know about at the time, but it was definitely going on. We found out later on, and because that's that's their interest. And then, of course, if people just take it in a casual set with no attention and think of it as recreational, so analogous to alcohol or marijuana, then the kind of experience that they're going to have is going to depend on whatever is going on. So if you take acid on walking down Haight Street with a group of friends, then what's your experience going to be? Because it's a heightening of perception. It could work out okay, and it's actually amazing considering the power of the drug that there weren't more casualties. So on a physiological level, they're extremely safe. But bad effects that have happened have almost all happened as a result of preparation in proper setting. And so. But anyway, so that was our assignment. We felt that our assignment was to take care of, help people communicate, and we wrote this book called The Psychedelic Experience, which is based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which was a suggestion by Aldous Huxley that you should, prepare people for these sessions like you would prepare somebody for dying. Not that you die, but the ego dies. That was kind of the idea, and then it's reborn. So you have a quiet set and setting, a meditative kind of approach, and oriented towards insight and no distractions. You see. And so that was what we did. So the book is basically. Well, I want to talk about the book, but before that also I want to just briefly mention, and there's a flyer out there, I'm in the midst of writing a series of books on the ecology of consciousness. They're short books, there's some flyers out there, and I have 1 or 2 copies on them. These are like my thinking about consciousness and its variations and modulations and so forth at the present time. So you're welcome to take one of these along.
Yeah, we've got lots of flyers there by, when we'll have the book sign after too.
Yeah, I'll have the book signing afterwards. There's a website that's listed and so like that. So the book covers basically a 5-year period, and it took us about 5 years to get it written and transcribed. The 5-year period covers us from the beginnings of the Harvard psilocybin research project, 1961, till about, so then after the project, Leary and Alpert got fired from Harvard. Actually, Alpert was the one that got fired. Leary was on a part-time contract, and so they terminated the contract. And I was neither fired nor never got it. I was a graduate student. I was just finished my graduate student studies and then a postdoctoral fellowship. And then, so then we all moved, rather than going the usual academic route to try to find another job as a professor or graduate someplace else, we decided we wanted to continue working with these because we all agreed, and not just the 3 of us. I mean, there were like a couple of dozen other graduate students and other people from the larger community who were interested in supporting this project, who wanted us to continue doing it and exploring it. And very soon it became obvious that the usual paradigms of doing research within an academic setting were okay, but they were limited. You know, these drugs could be used for therapy, but they have, for example, creative and spiritual implications that are not usually covered in therapy. And Leary was very much committed to exploring it all and communicating the possibilities. And plus, you know, we did not, according to, contrary to what the media at the time wanted to present, advocate the random use of anybody. You know, quite the contrary. And nor did we distribute the drug to anybody, or were involved in sales or anything like that nature. You know, but anyway. So let me read you. So it took us 5 years to publish, because Ramdas and I got together. We said, well, we should write a book. Leary has written a lot of books about this period, but we hadn't. And what about, you know, there's many different perspectives on every story. And we hadn't talked for quite a while about what we were going to do, so then we thought, well, we could talk. And then Ramdas had a stroke, you see. And so, which makes it very halting for him to talk. Then we got the idea, well, instead of writing, how could we write together? Maybe we could just do interviews on a tape record them and transcribe them, and you know, do it that way. And so we did do it that way. But I felt a little bad about it too, because I talk very fast, as you can see, and Ramdas talks very slowly. So this is not going to be fair. So we went through a lot of iterations. We recorded about 3 3-hour interviews. And we asked a psychiatrist friend of ours, Gary Bravo, to kind of mediate the discussion for us. And Ramdas and I both smoked pot. And we told Gary, no, you can't smoke pot because you have to keep us on track by asking us questions about this thing or the other thing. But pot helps the memory, actually, so, but not the tracking. Then we went through a lot of iterations of writing and rewriting and editing and selecting and condensing, and organized it into 5 parts. The first part really being the Harvard project, 2 years, and then when the research project at Harvard stopped, but we were still there. We had Leary and Alpert had appointments. Professor and I were still a postdoctoral graduate student, and then so we were still in the neighborhood, and we were still working, and we were more and more. We actually moved into community, into living to each other, because we wanted to talk with each other all the time. So we, instead of driving to each other's houses all the time, why don't we just live together? So we lived in an intentional community in the Harvard, in the Cambridge neighborhood. And we had a couple of projects in Zihuatanejo, Mexico, where we had people coming in so they could kind of do an intensive study in a completely isolated or protective environment where they didn't have to do anything else. And so then, around that time, the sensationalism around the drugs, multiplied, and Alpert was fired, and Leary, the university kind of separated itself from us, and there was a tremendous amount of judgmentalism, and we basically were not able to continue doing any research under the university auspices, but we wanted to continue doing it. So we had the opportunity to be given this large mansion, basically, through a friend of Peggy Hitchcock, who's a friend, and her 2 brothers had this large 3,000-acre ranch up in upstate New York, and which we were able to get at a very favorable rate of $1 rent a year, because it was a tax write-off. It had 64 rooms. It was kind of an ancient mansion. You'll see pictures of it in here. So we had an evolving community that lasted, you know, for several years, where 3 of us there were there, and then I went to India, and Leary went to India. We came back, and then there was a kind of a separation of the 3 of us. There were some conflicts that we couldn't resolve, and we decided it was more important to leave. And then Leary went off, and you know, he got arrested crossing the border into Mexico, and that started a whole series of long-term series of cases that he had pursued for the next 10 or 20 years of his life. And